powerful writing, like this book and like that passage that I just read, and like so many other passages in this book, it should transport you. It should touch you in a way that you can't articulate. It should take you out of your body almost, and take you somewhere else. And not only see and live and feel what the characters see and feel what the characters feel, but to create a new feeling within yourself, and to create a new understanding of the world inside yourself. All Quiet on the Western Front is a book that doesn't really need much of an introduction. If you've ever wanted to read anything anti-war, if you've ever done any research related to literature around anti-war movements or around World War I, this book always comes up. It's one of the big classics. And it's also always taught, not always, but it's commonly taught in modern lit courses, introduction to modern lit, most humanities courses will feature this book in some fashion or other, even if it's only just excerpts. And that's how I read it. I first read it in high school with a modern lit course, read it again in college, and I also just recently reread it. So in this video, I'm going to give you a rundown on the book, the story, and why I think it's a really important book, and also why I think we should try to read books like this more. To give you some background, All Quiet on the Western Front was first published in 1928. The author is Erich Maria Remarque. He is a German, or was a German soldier in World War I. He's a veteran. He survived the war, which was no small feat. Like I said, it was first published in 1928, and it was published in serialized form in newspapers. Do you remember what newspapers are? I'm old enough to remember newspapers, and I'm old enough to remember when newspapers actually meant something. But there once upon a time, and this is before my time, it was not uncommon for writers to publish short novels or a series of stories in newspapers in serialized formats. So meaning sort of like chunk by chunk, not necessarily chapter by chapter, but chunk by chunk, or story arc by story arc. And that's how this novel was first published. A year later, it was 1929, it was published in book format. And from there, it went on to sell 2.5 million copies in the first 18 months of publication in the year 1929. So think about that, 2.5 million copies of this book, originally written in German language, by a German soldier who fought on the German side of World War I, the losing side, very unpopular side in World War I, selling 2.5 million copies in 1929 and translated into 22 languages. So to give you a little perspective on the immense popularity of this book in its time, currently, I'm sorry, I have to look at some notes to get the numbers correctly here, but currently, to be a New York Times bestseller, unfortunately we have to kind of use that as kind of a standard, but to be a New York Times bestseller, this is not talking about quality, just sales, you would need to sell roughly 100,000 copies in 1 year. This book sold 2.5 million in the first 18 months. That's pretty incredible. Pretty incredible. And what's even more noteworthy is that 4 years later, in 1933, this book was banned by the Nazi Party in Germany. I know in 1933, Nazis were not entirely ruling, but they were coming into power, and they did have power over quite a bit of Germany, particularly Berlin, and they banned this book, and this book remained banned throughout the Nazi reign over Germany and Europe. So you can also put this on the banned books list. Its popularity is also remarkable because it's a brutal book. It's not a heroic book. It's not patriotic at all. And at the same time, it's not a sensationalist book. It doesn't whip up any kind of like fervor that you might expect. When you think anti-war, we think of protests, we think of, very rebellious and very, spiritualist kind of movements. Spiritualist meaning like, appealing to the spirit, very populist kind of movements. It's not like that at all. It's a very brutal book. It's very dry. And it's a very graphic and realistic depiction of the experience that soldiers had fighting on the front lines in World War I and the sort of atrocities that they endured. Sometimes they committed themselves, but more often than not, they endured and tried to sort of just survive bombardments. This is an era of war when machinery was coming into use in warfare. It was a very new thing. So things like the machine gun were very new. Aerial bombardment was very new. Very precise shelling, like just firing cannons and things like that. This was very new at that time. People didn't really understand what that meant. When I say people, the soldiers didn't really understand what that meant and what that was going to do to them. So they had to find ways to survive all of this, and very ill-equipped at the time too. So it's this strange juxtaposition really of man versus war machine. So like I said, it's a very brutal book. But the brutality, the real brutality of it isn't just the physical torment of war, but really of the spiritual and psychological degradation and torments that the soldiers go through. So to give a brief synopsis of the book, this is basically the story of 4 young men told through the eyes of one young man named Paul Baumer. And they are young men in Germany in the year 1916. They're about 18 or 19 years old. And they decide to leave school and join the German army to fight what is called the Great War, if you will. And they're told, or they believe, that they're going to become heroes, that they're fighting for their country, that they're doing the right thing, that they're a part of some sort of magnificent, movement that's going to usher in a great era for their country. But instead of becoming heroes, instead of participating in some sort of grandiose, patriotic thing, what they learn are the deadly lessons of war, particularly the brutality of war at this time. I should qualify that and say all war is brutal, but the brutality of war at this time was maybe unique to its times. And they also learn this kind of the sad truth that lies at the heart of all wars and ultimately of all societies. And that truth is that younger generations fight the wars that older generations plan. And that younger generations are used as a means to an end by older generations. That's really what they learn in this book. And I maybe even just gave away the whole video right there, but that's that. So, the narrative revolves around Paul Baumer. The story is told through his eyes. He's a German soldier stationed on the Western Front, obviously during World War I. Before joining the army, he has this typical, not idyllic, but just kind of typical countryside, small town life. He's attending school, and the thing that spurs him on, or sparks him and his friends and his colleagues on to join the army, are these very passionate speeches that are given by a particular teacher named Erich. And he sort of like cajoles and whips up this patriotic fury in the boys to go and join the army. And they do. So once they join up, they go to training camp, obviously, they go to boot camp, and they encounter this character, Himmelstas, who is an absolute jackass. He's the training officer who used to be a postman. So he's a mail carrier. He had no combat experience, was trained at the camp, and then went on to train more soldiers. So he's got no idea what what soldiering really is, what it is to really be a soldier. And yet somehow he's responsible for training these young men and then sending them off, basically sending them off to their death. But he's an absolute pain in the ass in the camp. He's a stickler for minute and insignificant details and duties and things like that, simply because he can be. And for some reason, he's bought into this narrative that soldiers are rigid and that discipline means following everything down to a T, and that nothing is ever perfect, nothing's ever correct, and that somehow this is going to make these boys become these great heroes for Germany. And of course, nothing could be further from the truth. So anyways, they get through boot camp. Obviously, no one is not going to get through boot camp unless they die in boot camp. Everyone is going off to fight. The country needs every single body it can out there to fight. You know, what we know now was a losing war. So he's got all these friends. We meet these other characters. There's Lear, there's Mueller, there's Kropp, Kemmerich, and others, and they're off to the front. And there they meet Stanislaus Kaczynski, and they refer to him as Kat. And Kat, basically, he's like this reservist who has been recalled up. So he's older. I don't think they give his age in the book. He's probably in his 30s, maybe. And he basically becomes a guiding figure for Paul and the other young men in their platoon and in their brigade, because he knows how to live as a soldier, and he's got the instincts of how to survive attacks and bombardments and things like that. But more importantly, he's kind of got this instinct of how to survive in the camps that soldiers live in, meaning like how to get extra food, how to find extra supplies that they need, how to get warm clothes, how to get more ammunition, things like that. And also like how to predict when the attacks are coming. He's experienced enough to understand the pattern of when the rocket attacks begin. There's this kind of pattern where they send out tracers and these like sort of parachutes to try to light up the sky, to figure out that the artillery fires, to figure out where should they position and where should they aim the shells. And so he's able to know. He's also kind of worked out the timing of when things are going to happen. And strangely enough, he's usually correct, and it helps Paul and his friends survive. So they go on and they start fighting. It's brutal. It's relentless. It's infamous. It's been portrayed now in many films and things like that. So I'm not going to go into tons of detail, and some of it is pretty grotesque. But what I do want to point out, and something that I think is really worth noting, is that the first of the group of boys or of young men to die in the first attack dies on page 11 of the book. So right away on page 11, the first one is down. 10 pages later, another one is down, and that's Kemmerich, and he's just one of 70 that dies in an attack. And after this attack, they take Kemmerich back to a field hospital, and they spend some time with him. He's been badly injured. He gets a leg amputation, but it doesn't go well. And a few days later, he dies. And they know he's going to die. He doesn't really know he's going to die. No one can really tell him that he's going to die. So they spend time with him at the field hospital, literally watching, the life drain out of him, quite literally. I mean, he, is bleeding and rotting to death. So, and while that happens, they start to wonder who can take his boots. But they don't do it in sort of like that sounds really savage and like it sounds, like they're being vultures. But it's more just in a utilitarian sense that the boots are still in very good condition. They hadn't been at the front for very long. They really had just left the camp, or they had just left boot camp. And they just wonder like who's going to take those boots when he dies, because they know he's going to die. So, all right, so they go through more battles, more skirmishes, and they quickly realize that everything they learned in boot camp was useless, was a waste. All the discipline from Himmelstas I mean, they knew it at the time, but now they're experiencing it that it was just a waste of time. They haven't learned anything practical, and if they want to survive at all, they need to listen to Kat and the other veterans, and they need to very quickly develop these instincts and almost kind of this like sixth sense of how to survive. And that survival, like I said before, means not only how to survive an attack, but it means also how to attack, and it also means how to scavenge. That's another thing that's happening, like after an attack, and even during an attack or during a skirmish, if they come across someone who's dead or they've killed someone, they will quickly pillage the body and take what they can. And that could be food, weapons, clothing, anything that could be useful for them. So this goes on for a period of time, and then eventually Paul is able to take some leave. He takes about 2 weeks leave, and he returns to his hometown. When he's there, he quickly develops this deep sense of alienation from both the people in the town and from himself. He goes to his home, sees his family. Obviously, it's very awkward and uncomfortable. His family, they kind of think he's a bit of a hero, and they're asking him a lot of, what he's done over there and how is it going. And he doesn't want to tell them, how horrible it is. He doesn't want to tell them what it's like to see your best friends, shot through the head or, die in a bombshell, blown apart, this sort of thing. So, he can't really articulate it. He kind of holds back a bit, and he's keeping it all kind of pent inside of himself. There's one scene where he's staying in his family's home. He's staying in the room that he grew up in, and he's got this shelf of books. He's a book lover. He used to save all of his pocket money to buy books and to read literature, and he reminisces about how he would save money to buy a complete edition rather than a cheap serialized paperback. But as he kind of looks at these books on this shelf, he doesn't have any interest in them. And then he's kind of disturbed by that, and he starts to wonder, who is he? Who is he now? Who has he become? And has he become the person that he wants to be? And he won't directly think it, but we can infer that he has not become who he wants to be. And that's not because of any of his choice. Well, he did choose to go to war, but the war is not what he thought it was, and the war is not giving him the experience that he thought he would have to become some sort of man, And speaking of men, he spends time with his father. He goes out for drinks. People want to buy him drinks and hear all of his war stories, and he doesn't have any. So instead, he has to listen to them tell him how to fight the war and how to win the war. And he realizes that these people have no idea what's going on out there. They don't know whether that's their fault or not, whether it's just because news reports just aren't accurate or whatever. They just don't know what's going on, and he just can't relate to any of it, and he just kind of sits through it and tolerates it, gets himself drunk, and finds himself wanting to, basically just go back to the front and be with his mates fighting. And he does that. So he returns to his comrades, and he starts to immediately feel comfortable in the place that he thought, was nothing but a pit of torment. Suddenly he's there, and he's out on a patrol, and this patrol runs into a skirmish in a battle, and he's hiding out in a crater, a bombshell crater. Pretty ironic that would be a place to hide, that would be a safe place. And a French soldier jumps into the crater along with him, and they have some hand-to-hand combat, and he kills this soldier. And he realizes this is the first time that he has looked at the soldier, looked at the person, looked at the man that he is killing, and kills the man face to face like that. Up until now, most of the killing, actually all the killing that he's done, has either been throwing grenades or firing a gun at some sort of range and not actually being close and not witnessing the recipient of that dying. And this is the first time he's actually been really close, face to face with the person that he's killed, and it's a very disturbing experience for him. It's a very disturbing scene in the book. It's very well written. It's not sensationalist or anything like that, but it's pretty disturbing, and it's disturbing on a psychological level. It's not told in a grotesque blood splatter kind of way, but it's more just like what's going on in his mind. And he's in this crater with the dead body for a while during this attack, and he goes through this whole grieving process for the man that he's just killed, and he apologizes to the corpse, and he fishes through the pockets and finds what he believes to be, the man's address and family, and he tells himself that he promises that he's going to go see the family and tell them what happened, but of course we know that that's not going to happen. So soon after that, he's wounded and sent back to a hospital with one of his friends, with Albert. And so now he's gone through these attacks. He's gone home. He's realized that he's alienated from his family, from his town, and he doesn't really understand who he is now. So he's even feeling alienation from himself. And now he's wounded and he's in this hospital, and his initial thought is that he's going to get amputated and he's going to die just like Erich died. And there's a lot of hints that things could go that way. But things don't go that way. His injuries are not severe, but he does need to have a little bit of physical rehab, and he needs some time to recover. And during that time, he's in this hospital. He realizes that this hospital is in pretty bad shape. It's very poorly staffed. It's very poorly equipped in terms of like medicine and in terms of the facilities. And it's at this point that we realize, or at least that Paul realizes, and it's shown to us, if we didn't already know it, didn't already understand it, that morale has collapsed on the German side. The German side, they are underfunded, they're under-equipped, that there's just no way that they're going to win. They can't even seem to win a battle. And they also realize that they are, the other side has much better equipment, much better training. There's a lot more aerial bombardments, and the bombardments are, they're on target much more. So they've gotten much better at dropping these bombs and things like that. So amidst all of this, Paul's spirit also finally sort of cracks, and he kind of breaks at this point. And it's a very sad point, because he doesn't break and think like, okay, I need to change, or I need to run away, or I need to break free, or something like that. It's the kind of break of futility. He finds himself in a state of futility, and he just kind of checks out, really, and just accepts that, this is fate, and that he's survived this attack. He got wounded and he survived, but it's, how many more times is that going to happen? It's highly unlikely that he's going to continue to survive. So the end of the war is drawing near. And there's one more thing. Just when you think like, okay, it really can't get much worse. Kat is killed, and Kat's death sort of sets off this chain. Basically, all of the main characters, particularly all of Paul's friends from his hometown, they basically all die, and Paul chronicles each of their deaths, and it's pretty gruesome stuff that happens. And again, I want to say that what makes it gruesome isn't necessarily the depictions of their deaths. It's actually written quite artfully, given its grim topic. What's so gruesome about it is just that it's just this one by one by one by one, all of these people die and die horribly and die very futile, often sometimes even absurd deaths. The ways that people could die from a shell attack or from a bombing, or even just like a single random gunshot, and then that's it. It's over for this person. So Paul kind of, he realizes that he sees a future that doesn't have much purpose, and he's sort of resigned to the inevitability of his death. And it's not like the march of time, like eventually you will die after you reach old age. It's just that it's just a matter of time, and an event will happen that's completely out of his control, and he will die, just like all of his friends have died. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about the ending. I've taken you through most of the book, but there are a few things that I've left out. There are a few things I think are significant that if you do decide to read this book, I don't want to completely spoil it for you. But at the same time too, like there's nothing I've talked about here that you couldn't just read online or get from something else. But I do think that these are all really important points, and they're going to sort of lead you into what the greater point that I want to make, which is that, yes, this is an anti-war novel, and it's clearly against war, but it's also a novel that's about lies and about deceit. And it's about the lies and the deceit that one generation uses to get another generation to do its bidding, basically. And this is a very clear example of when that happened in the world, that this war was fought by young men and young women who were working in hospitals and on the front lines as well. And they didn't really know what they were doing. They were cajoled into doing this. They were told it was their patriotic duty by an older generation. And the older generation plotted the war, they planned the war, they continued to maintain the war, all at the expense of the younger generation. And Paul realizes that very early in the book, and all the soldiers realize that. So they're fighting this war knowing that they never would have chosen to fight this war themselves. They're fighting it for someone else. And so there's this sort of like strange duality in their minds of knowing that it's not their choice to do it, that it doesn't make any sense, that another generation had kind of cajoled them or forced them into it, and yet every morning they wake up and they do it, or all night long they're out fighting. So they've always got these two halves, two different thoughts in their minds. And so in that sense, this is a story that's really a story as old as time. It goes back to the ancient Greeks and even before them, of one generation sacrificing another generation to maintain power, to try to gain more power, or to have some other sort of benefit. But the generation that gets sacrificed is highly unlikely to ever benefit from that action. And that's really another truth about World War I and about this book, is that the generation that fought this war, in the aftermath of the war, they didn't gain anything from any of it. There was no benefit for any of them. So there's a passage in here that I want to read that I think really nicely illustrates that point and a lot of the other points that come up. And there'll be one more thing to sort of come out of all of this. Okay, so this is starts on page 10, and this is one of the first major deaths in the book. There was indeed one of us who hesitated and did not want to fall into line. That was Joseph Bem, a plump, homely fellow. But he did allow himself to be persuaded. Otherwise, he would have been ostracized, and perhaps more of us thought as he did, but no one could very well stand out, because at that time even one's parents were ready with the word coward. No one had the vaguest idea what we were in for. The wisest were just the poor and simple people. They knew the war to be a misfortune, whereas those who were better off and should have been able to see more clearly what the consequences would be were beside themselves with joy. Kaczynski said this was a result of their upbringing. It made them stupid. And what Katz said he had thought about. Strange to say, Bem was the first one of us to fall. He got hit in the eye during an attack, and we left him lying for dead. We couldn't bring him with us because we had to come back helter-skelter. In the afternoon, suddenly we heard him call and saw him crawling about in no man's land. He had only been knocked unconscious. Because he could not see and was mad with pain, he failed to keep under cover and so was shot down before anyone could go and fetch him in. Naturally, we couldn't blame Erich for this. Where would the world be if one brought every man to book? There were thousands of Erichs, all of whom were convinced that they were acting for the best in a way that cost them nothing. And that is why they let us down so badly. So I think that is a fantastic passage. And I think that that passage in this book, so early in this book, is really something that's fantastic. I mean, to come out with that so early in the book and take that risk to play the whole hand of the whole point of the book right there on page 10, that these young men were misled and were let down in a way that will cost them their own lives. To come out and say that right away on page 10, it's a very big risk to take in a book. And also for the characters to, so early, to just say, there's nothing we could do about it. We're here now and this is it. And somehow, we're going to have to endure it. Because if they say no, like they said, even their own families will call them cowards. So there's this whole strange absurdity that's going on here. And not only that, but just the prose, the way that this is written, is just so good. The writing in here is just fantastic. For a book written, published in 1928. So let's say it was written in 1927 or 1926. Over 100 years ago. And it's just so powerful. The messaging in there, so powerful and still so pertinent. And the quality of the writing in this book, absolutely fantastic. And this is the final point I want to make. And if you're still watching this video, I want to say thank you. You're amazing that you're still with me as I rant about this book. It's really important as a reader, if you love books and if you love reading, to try to read widely. It's good to read deep. It's good to know what you like. And it's good to go deep into what you like. That's fantastic to do. I do that all the time. But from time to time, we need to broaden out a bit. And part of your broadening is to try to find something that's going to continue to enrich you. Not just entertain you, but to enrich you, to help you learn something, and to help you realize and see what really good writing is, what really powerful writing can do. Powerful writing like this book and like that passage that I just read and like so many other passages in this book. It should transport you. It should touch you in a way that you can't articulate. It should take you out of your body almost and take you somewhere else. And not only see and live and feel what the characters see and feel what the characters feel, but to create a new feeling within yourself and to create a new understanding of the world inside yourself. And I think it's really important to read classic books from the past that we can raise political points against in our current enlightened era. But that's not to say that the experience that people went through was invalid. And it's really important, I think, to read about the experience of others in order to gain a better understanding of what we experience today, and in order to gain some appreciation also for the world that we live in today, and also to understand some of the problems that we still have, in the world that we have today. A lot of the problems we have are still rooted in ancient problems. World War I was the root, was a symptom of a much larger problem. So So that's the point I want to try to make here. I don't know if I've articulated that well. And if you've stayed with me, I hope you've gotten my point. And the point here is this is an important book, not because it's anti-war, but because it's against one generation throwing another generation away, simply because it wants to gain more power and more wealth. That's what this book is really about. So there you go. My name's Carl. This has been Please Read Your Book, and I hope to see you again soon.